Namaskar, greetings everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's a very special day today. This is the 100th birth anniversary of Sri Sitaram Goelji, and we have been doing a series, and today is the culminating day of that series. So we went over, we did 6 sessions on various subject areas that Sitaramji had addressed in his books, and those sessions are already on YouTube, and a link was there in your invite, and we'll be happy to share that link to you again one more time. But today it's a special day in many ways. Today I will just go over very brief introduction to those who may be uninitiated. The position of Sitaram Goelji and Ram Swarupji both. So India has seen many freedom struggles against the Muslim invaders even earlier, and later against the British, and various freedom struggles had their own calculus. There was a sense of ideology even in medieval times. But there is a parallel freedom struggle that is also going on, and that is of the freedom of the intellectual freedom movement, and that is even older. You can say, when you use the term freedom struggle, it has a lot more years to it. And position of Sitaramji is that he can be called the one of the two fathers of the freedom struggle of the Indian intellectual mind, or the Indian mind. And that Indian mind, as you all are already aware, is still somehow caught up in these chains of Anglophilia, secularism, socialism, Marxism, and all those shapes. So the person or the two or the duo who started this freedom struggle against these invasions of the mind and one of them is Sitaramji. And there is no other better person to do justice to the legacy of Sitaramji than Dr. Koenraad Elst, who is amongst us, and he will be delivering today's lecture. So today's lecture, the topic is what is just getting into Sitaramji's mind and extrapolating it outward and creating a projection that what is next. If this is the freedom struggle, then there will be more freedom fighters in this, and there are new authors and new thinkers who are coming up, and that's very pleasant to see. But to spin it into a fabric and project it in the future and spell out some of the needs that are there for this intellectual freedom movement. Dr. Koenraad Elst today will be delivering the Sitaram Goel Centennial Memorial Lecture, and will go over some of the salient points, binding these topics together and projecting in the future. So Dr. Elst, over to you. And it's indeed a pleasure to have you again.
Thank you. So good evening. We're going to talk about the birthday boy. Sitaram Goel was born exactly 100 years ago. in Chhara, Haryana. Chhara is a village just west of Delhi. If you go westwards from Delhi, the very first district of Haryana you meet is Jhajjar. And so in that district, you'll find the village of Chhara. Yes, that's more visible, I think. Okay, so on the 16th of October, 1921, for those of you who are inclined to make horoscopes, as they often do in India, it was at 8:34 in the evening. All right, so he belonged to the merchant Agarwal caste, which very often means great prosperity, but not in his case. He grew up quite poor, which is perhaps not so exceptional in India under the British and especially under the post-British period. But okay, that was the situation. And nevertheless, they found sustenance in their ancestral Vaishnavism and in the devotional poetry of a local 18th century sage, namely Sant Garib Das. Then when growing up, he also contracted, so to speak, influences from Arya Samaj reformism and Mahatma Gandhi. And so as a young lad, he was a Ghandian activist in Harijan bastis or neighborhoods. And so he had a very positive outlook on life, all while getting his master's degree in history from Delhi University. He grew up to be a friendly and generous man. That's how I've always known him. And older people who knew him even earlier confirmed this picture. He was always attentive to the needs of others, especially of personnel. Like if a driver had to wait out in the hot sun or something, he would make sure to get him a drink or lunch. He always gave tips to doorkeepers and people like that, and so on. So that's what he was. And so even though in this story we will see him dealing with a lot of grim issues, he was always humorous and wasn't given to depressed views of the future. He usually did see a way out. In the mid-1940s, he lived in Delhi, where he met many people, including many people who were his age, but who were fated to become quite important, like at the Times of India editor Girilal Jain, who was, as he himself told me, the second most powerful man in India after the Prime Minister. Then diplomat L.C. Jain, philosophy professor Daya Krishna, who wrote a very important book about Hindu philosophy, where he struck a good, a well-balanced note, you see, not given to the literalist Hindu traditionalism, nor to dismissive, skeptical, poo-pooing attitude of Western scholars and their Indian imitators. Then the economist Raj Krishna, who was to become a member of the Planning Commission, it is he who invented the term the Hindu growth rate. You see, as a member of the Nehruvian socialist establishment, he had to whitewash the dismal economic performance of the Nehruvian government. And so he blamed India's proverbial poverty on Hinduism, saying, yeah, you see, we're not advancing, but that's, you know, what do you want? That's the Hindu growth rate. When in reality, of course, it was the Nehru growth rate. And when Hindus escaped the very stifling regime in India and went to the West, immediately they shone brightly as economic success stories. So that's what India has been becoming after the liberalization, which started carefully in 1991. Then he also knew the arts Tsarina, as she is usually called in the media, Kapila Vatsyayana. She lived the longest of all these people. They're all gone, but she died, I think, 2 years ago. Then, of course, his mentor and lifelong friend, Ram Swarup. And this was a really important influence on him. Ram Swarup in 1944 founded the Changers Club. This was a progressive, skeptical debating forum. And its name is not explained here, but I'll explain it right away. Its name was a pun on Karl Marx, who said that philosophers so far have only described the world, but the thing to do is to change the world. So the Changers Club meant to be more than just a debating society, but in effect, of course, it was exactly a debating society and not more. The Changers Club also issued an interesting series of booklets, of which the very first one was called an indictment. And it is an indictment of the Congress leadership during the Quit India agitation, of which both had been a part, most actively Ram Swarup. And so he felt personally betrayed when that movement came to nothing, largely due to confusion in the mind of the Congress leadership. And so he expressed his dissatisfaction in that booklet. And you can see that many ideas in there are precisely the stuff that would develop later in his later works, beginning perhaps with the contempt of Jawaharlal Nehru. Here he attacked Nehru from the left, from the nationalist side also. And later on, it would be different problems with Nehru, but that aversion for Nehru is a constant in both Ram Swarup and Sita Goel's life. Then Goelji almost joined the Communist Party. He had made up his mind, he was committed to communism, but the day he wanted to enroll, become a candidate member, the government had decided to have a crackdown on the communists because they were suspected of involvement in subversive activities. So the communists themselves told Goel, wait a minute, until the coast is safe. But so in the intervening days and weeks, he discussed in all seriousness the value of communism with Ram Swarup. He also kept on reading the communist classics. So because of those influences, he became an articulate anti-communist. Indeed, he set up the leading anti-communist think tank outside of the West, namely the Society for the Defense of Freedom in Asia. It published factual studies about Soviet and Maoist atrocities and their dismal socioeconomic performance. Like there's one title, Whom Shall We Believe?, in which he compares what the Indian Communist Party says about the communist success stories abroad, and then what the Soviets and Maoists themselves say. And so it seems that for all their mendacity, the parties themselves were more truthful, more honest about their shortcomings than the very propaganda-oriented Indian communists. Because communism was the major focus in those days, there was coming into being an Indian anti-communist party, the Swatantra Party, inspired or led by Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, one of the great freedom fighters, who was Governor General of India in 1947-1950. The party was still in its formative stages. It couldn't formally participate in the elections of 1957. So it struck a deal with the Jansang, which is the forerunner of the BJP. It was reconstituted as BJP in 1980. But so at that time, that party was already active. And so the Swatantra Party negotiated, to have a few independent candidates on BJP or on Jansang tickets. And so one of them was for Goel in Khajuraho, the place famous for the erotic temples. Anyway, it was a serious business, and he was chosen as a candidate for the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament, because he was one of the very rare people who could stand up to Jawaharlal Nehru. You see, Nehru was a very weak and confused and destructive, or at least harmful prime minister, but he was a great orator. And he could scare people, he could intimidate people. If he attacked, it was a serious thing. And so Goelji was one of the few who was firm enough and eloquent enough to stand up to that. But unfortunately, he was not elected. And so he left politics, but not immediately. First, to see there's another side of his work that develops in this period. He rediscovered Hindu-Buddhist spirituality. He already wrote a few books on this. And he even found the time for writing historical novels in his mother tongue, Hindi. One of them is about a famous episode in Buddhist history in the old age and the first years after the death of the Buddha, namely about how 7 rules of conduct, 7 rules of non-decline, as they strictly are called, how these first form the backbone and the secret of the invincibility of the Virgi Republic, and how later these are in decline, these values are discarded by the population, and so their society becomes weak, and then it gets conquered by its enemy, the expanding kingdom of Magadha. And so he writes the novel as a historical novel, but as happens so often, there are also hints at the modern age, and so the corrupt, treacherous king of the Virgi state looks very much like Jawaharlal Nehru, has the same talents and the same shortcomings. So he says explicitly that any likeness to the modern age is pure coincidence, but it doesn't look like a coincidence. He also prepared Hindi translations of classic works of philosophy, namely 3 books by Plato about the later life and death of Socrates. And also in history, Kincaid's novel, The Great Rebel, which is about Shivaji, the Indian freedom fighter par excellence. As for Socrates, When asked about the major influences on his life, Socrates as the one non-Hindu influence is also given pride of place. Socrates was a lover of the truth. In Hindi, Satyakam, Socrates. And so that has been the leading principle in Goelji's life as well. In 1961, Goel approached Organizer, which was one of the only Hindu-minded media at that time. Organizer is the official paper of the RSS, the Hindu nationalist movement. Paper in English, there's also one in Hindi, the Panchajanya, in which he would also write, but that's a later story. So he wrote a critique of Nehru in installments, which came out later as a book called Genesis of Nehruism. But that series was stopped. The RSS leadership intervened to have it stopped. So this came as a shock to Goelji. The justification given by the RSS in this case may have some substance. Namely, they were afraid that if anything would happen to Nehru, that then the RSS as a whole would be blamed, as had happened effectively in 1948, when an ex-member of the RSS assassinated Mahatma Gandhi. So then there was an enormous crackdown on the entire RSS. So that they wanted to avoid. So they didn't want to be associated with the critique of Nehru. Now that Nehru was a very harmful influence for India was proven again with the Chinese invasion in 1962, when the army under Nehru's ultimate command turned out to be completely unprepared for this serious military challenge. Goel was asked to cooperate with the government in case the Chinese would occupy the northeast of India, which was expected. And so he agreed, but on condition that Nehru should step down as prime minister, which of course never happened. So nothing came of it. But the good side of the Chinese invasion is that it stopped the progress of the Communist Party of India. You see, much to many people's surprise, the population of India stood as one to defend their country. Like, for instance, many women sold off their jewelry in order to donate to the national defense effort. Especially, there was a separatist movement in South India, the Dravidianists, and it turned out that even they were not that separatist. You see, whatever the leadership might say, the rank and file of that party also massively came to India's defense. And so this was a clear show of loyalty to India by the Indians, and therefore also a show of no confidence in the Communist Party, which at that point was not nationalist at all. In fact, a slogan of the communists in those days was, India's chairman is also, no, sorry, China's chairman is also India's chairman. So that, you see, that people didn't like at all. And so for the time being, there was no danger anymore of communism coming to power in India. That was not the only consideration, but it was one of them for Goelji to leave the political struggle. So he went into business, he became a publisher. Well, he first of all became an importer and exporter of books. And he had a very good reputation in that sector for drawing up catalogs and descriptive catalogs where you see if you looked through them, you really knew what the books were of which you could find the name, the mere name elsewhere. And so he became very successful in that business. He also published books and tried to focus on useful topics for the Hindu cause, though he didn't write any himself at that time. Then in 1981, he retired from business, left it mostly to his son and to his nephew. And he himself started another publishing house, as well, smaller outfits specifically for ideological works, mainly initially for the works by Ram Swarup, his friend who was a far more ascetic type. He never went into business, he didn't marry, he didn't go into politics. He was just a philosopher. And so some of his writings are there in the Voice of India Fund. He himself, Goelji, started writing series for Organizer and for Panchajanya. And these series of articles were turned into books published by Voice of India. So the very first one, Hindu Society Under Siege, has on the very first page a statement that is more or less a declaration of what Voice of India was going to be all about. Hindu society is the only society in the world today which presents a continuity of cultural existence. Most societies have undergone a traumatic transformation due to the invasion and victory of latter-day ideologies, Christianity, Islam, and now also communism. Hindu culture can meet the same frightful fate if there is no Hindu society to sustain it. You see, I interrupt here. Well, some other cultures still exist, but in museums. You see, we have so many excavations of Egyptian culture. If you want to know about the DNA of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, well, nowadays you see this can all be investigated. We know a whole lot about Egyptian civilization, but nevertheless it is dead. You know, it can't be recovered like that. And so in the case of Hinduism, by contrast, the Hindu culture is not yet a museum object. There is a society that keeps it alive. However, and I continue the quote, this great society is now besieged by the same dark and deadly forces, and its beneficiaries no more seem interested in its survival because they have fallen victim to hostile propaganda. They have developed towards it an attitude of utter indifference, if not downright contempt. Hindu society is in mortal danger as never before. So this seems to be a very negative statement, a very negative prediction. It is not necessarily that, because the work of Voice of India in the next decades consists precisely in creating the circumstances that will allow the survival of Hindu society. I mean, I hear many Hindus, even many very articulate Hindu intellectuals who take a very pessimistic attitude to say, well, you know, Hinduism is going to disappear and Islam is going to take over, or Christianity is going to take over. And you see, Hinduism is a lost cause. Well, that certainly was not Goelji. You know, he never said things like that. Yes, Hindu society is in mortal danger, but there are still ways towards recovery. And so it was the business of Voice of India to explore those. And especially if you study the hostile ideologies, you find that they have weaknesses too, that they are not at all invincible. So the statement I just quoted outlines a task for the remainder of the writings of Ram Swarup and Sita Goel, namely detailing the history and the ideological motivation of Hinduism's enemies, and also showing the contrast of those with Hindu Dharma. These writings, I find, have quite an influence. I mean, very many people tell me that it was such a revelation when they read these for the first time, that it changed their whole way of thinking, their whole attitude to the communal problem, to Hinduism versus Islam, Christianity. Fascinating through their combination of a fearless analysis of tough questions with a passion for the benefits of ancient Dharma, ancient Hinduism, and also of the contemporary real-life Hindus. You see, those of you who have never been in India, I need to tell you that it's quite a pleasant thing to go to India and stay there and meet the people there. Of course, you have all kinds of people like everywhere, but on average, you see, Hindus are friendly, are hospitable, are also interested. You see, they're interested in foreign countries, foreign religions, and so on, not because they're not satisfied with Hinduism, just because they're curious. Hinduism fosters the search for knowledge. So the philosophy behind these booklets was this: if you take up the ideological struggle, you can avoid a physical struggle to materialize eventually. So it is a humane project par excellence. It spares human lives. It's important to say this because in places like Wikipedia and the usual Indology sources, you find claims that he is the most extreme Islamophobe in India. Well, not at all. He, of course, makes a distinction between the Islamic ideology and those who have fallen prey to that ideology, also known as Muslims. And so Muslims are just the same people as Hindus. You know, genetically, they're both Indian. I mean, among Muslims, among especially elite Muslims, you still have a cultivation of, you know, some descent in the strictly paternal line from some Arab or Turkic invader. But you see, those invaders came as soldiers, which meant only men. And so they took wives among the local population. Either they abducted them or love jihad or sex slavery. Or sometimes it was also love marriage. But in each of those cases, it meant that the babies born from such unions were already 50% native Indian. And that percentage would only increase the next generations. So for all practical purposes, Indian Muslims are genetically the same as Hindus. To that extent, recently Mohan Bhagwat, the leader of the RSS, was right when he said that Muslims and Hindus have the same DNA. It's only that that isn't very important. You see, Muhammad situated his mother, with whom he shared at least 50% DNA, he situated her in hell because she died too soon to become a Muslim. And by contrast, for example, the Parsis or Zoroastrians, they came into India from Iran as refugees. They did bring their families. They did not intermarry with local women. And the Parsis you see today are quite pure Persians. And indeed, you see their approach to blood purity, if that's what you want to call it, is such that if an intermarriage takes place, if one of the Parsis marries a non-Parsi, then they have to go out of the community. Then they have to become the religion of that spouse. So they're very pure. They are really pure Persian DNA, not Indian. And yet they form no problem. There is no partition, no Parsi homeland or something like that. There is no Parsi separatism. There are no riots with Parsis and so on. So this DNA is really not so material. And so the fact that Muslims have the same DNA as Hindus is also not very material. It is their ideology which has estranged them from their Hindu neighbors. And so it is that ideology which Goelji dissects and diagnoses. When Goelji died in 2003, his son Pradeep said very well what the effect was of Goel on his readers. They won our hearts with their minds, meaning Goelji and Ram Sarup. They won our hearts with their minds. Now, for a historian, the likely point of interest is, of course, Indian history and what we can learn from it. So, Hinduism was defeated for centuries on end, was always retreating. And so what was the cause of the defeat? Now, many people, including many Hindus, think that this was because of a lack of valor, that Hindus are cowards. This is what Mahatma Gandhi said. You see, the Muslim is a natural bully and the Hindu a natural coward. Now, that may have been Gandhi's view, but it's not correct. It's not borne out by history at all. Hindus resisted heroically against the invasions. They were not successful in the long run, or in the very long run they were successful, but they were beaten many times. But it's not because of a lack of courage, not of a lack of a will to fight. They didn't keep up with the strategic novelties. And they had some problems of disunity once in a while. But valor was certainly not lacking. You see, this is a myth popular among Pakistanis and among Khalistanis, that is to say neo-Sikh separatists. They like to boast that it is they who defeated the Mughal Empire, that it is they who protected Hindus and so on. This is not the truth at all. The Sikhs were not a military sect as is nowadays claimed. They formed a military order at the fag end of the history of the 10 gurus that made Sikhism. And even then, you see, he didn't rebel against Mughal power. You see, it's the Mughals who sought him out, not the other way around. And so, yes, he did some fighting. He lost his sons on those occasions. But in the end, he made his peace with the Mughals. He even became some sort of a courtier of Aurangzeb's successor. This is in 1707. And it is only when he was succeeded by a Hindu monk, Banda Bairagi, that the Sikhs did rise in revolt. Unsuccessfully, by the way, but they did rise in revolt. And then, some decennia later, it was the Hindu victories of the Marathas that cleared the space, that weakened the Mughal Empire to such an extent that the Sikhs got their chance and a Sikh kingdom was founded. So yes, you see, Hindu heroism, that was very much there. But a negative development that did take place in the Middle Ages, that was partly due to the Islamic concern to kill off as many Brahmins as possible. as many brains as possible. They had this effect that the Hindu heroism went waste because of the power of thought that was not used to analyze the situation. This was increasingly so. You see, as history progresses, you see Hindus being heroic and dying, but not winning. And so that strategic acumen that was clearly missing. And it's when Shivaji came, Shivaji in the 17th century, he did have this strategic vision. And that's when Hindus started reconquering and pushing the Muslims back. It's because of disunity. This is what the RSS likes to say. Oh yeah, you know, Hindus need unity. Well, there are, of course, cases where unity made the difference. Like the case of Salar Massoud Ghaznavi, who was the nephew of the more famous invader Mahmud Ghaznavi. So in 1033, a coalition of Hindu kings came together, including the famous philosopher King Raja Bhoja, and they together fought a decisive battle with Salar Massoud Ghaznavi in 1033, the Battle of Bahraich, and they defeated Ghaznavi. So unity could be successful, and then what followed shows what happens with disunity. So they now set their sights on Lahore, which had become a Muslim capital, and Lahore is the main city of West Punjab. And so quarrels developed within the coalition. They fought over the spoils of a reconquered Lahore, which wasn't reconquered yet. And because of this, the coalition fell apart before they could even lay siege to Lahore. And so they never reconquered it. That's what you get with disunity. However, unity and disunity are automatically, in real life, automatically created by a certain vision. You see, if you all see Islam as the problem, then it's very easy to cobble together a convenient coalition that has unity, because the danger for all of the participants is the same. So they can get together to fight that one danger. So if you have the vision, then automatically it leads to unity whenever needed. But the situation today is like just the opposite. Any positive vision has been displaced by an interiorization of the enemy's vision. Mokoleism, which means the interiorization of the way the British looked upon India, and its Marxist successor ideology, because that's also a Western and Westernizing ideology. They penetrated far deeper than Islam. They had far more influence. Islam was oppressive, but you could ignore it as much as possible, and otherwise it didn't care about you as long as you paid taxes. Well, the rest was not so important. Whereas since the British, and then in independent India, the left-wing intellectuals, they propagated their own views through the system of education, through culture, through Bollywood. And so they got much farther in this than Islam ever did. We note in particular that they attack very much the Brahmin caste and the caste system as such. Now, it so happens that these are the two main defenses of Hindu society. Alexander the Great already understood that the Brahmin caste is the one that, in their own words, teaches our people to live with honor. And so that instills a national unity, a national will, so that people will defend themselves against the invaders. This was even true in the British period. like a very large percentage of freedom fighters who gave their life for the freedom struggle were Brahmins. And then this decentralized social organization, better known as the caste system, that was identified by the Christian missionary Francis Xavier as the great hurdle to conversions. So right now you have millions in India that have been forcibly converted to Christianity, or at least that have been lured into Christianity. And that, and who therefore toe the line of de-Brahmanizing their whole history and attacking the caste system. Now there is a fourth factor, and that is the complete loss of self-respect on the part of Hindus. And that's a problem that long predates the modern Islamic invasions. Well, the case that Goelji always would bring up, and that explains a lot of the Hindu attitude towards non-Hindus, is the case of Mahaji Scindia. He led the Peshwa forces, the Maratha forces, in around 1770. So after suffering a bad defeat against the Afghans 10 years before, he reconquered this territory, including Delhi, and therefore he liberated the Mughal emperor, who was the prisoner of the Afghan forces. Now, upon liberating the Mughal emperor, Mahaji Scindia did not receive his thank you and much less his submission. On the contrary, it is he himself, the most powerful man in India, who prostrated before the Mughal emperor. This was Shah Alam II. Though he could have folded the Mughal empire right there. But yes, you see, he had this diplomatic hesitation. So he didn't fold the Mughal empire, on the contrary. He submitted, he prostrated, flat on the floor. He received the official title Protector of the Emperor. And so he was physically strong, but mentally submissive. This Goelji has also written at the end of his life, is the secret of today's Hindutva forces, the RSS specifically, that they have a lot of strength, not just physical strength, but even in modern terms. An important equivalent, for instance, is electoral strength. So the BJP has lots of votes. They have a comfortable majority in parliament, and yet they are mentally submissive. They play by the rules laid down by the secularists, and they try to woo the Muslims as much as possible. So they have the same mentality as Mahaji Scindia. They're strong, but they're mentally submissive. So Goelji did not have much luck with the RSS and organizer. In 1962, his series about Nehru was already cancelled. In 1985, the same thing happened, because his series at the time were mostly about Islam. And so the RSS wanted to curry favor with Islam. Like there was one incident where the editor of Organizer had scrapped in Goelji's article the criticism of the Sufis. You see, the Sufis, there's a lot of myth making about them. And so it is said that they are tolerant, that they are nice Muslims, that in fact Hinduism even took over many things that contributed to Anyway, so the Sufis, there's much myth making about them. And so Malkani didn't like it that Goelji pinpricked that good reputation of the Sufis, reputation for tolerance and mysticism and so on. Goelji showed that on the contrary, Sufis were often the leaders of hate campaigns against the Hindus. But Malkani said, yeah, well, but I don't want the truth to come out on this. This is too nice a story. And after all, we have to live with them. So it's better to appease them. And Goelji remarked, but it is they who have to learn to live with us. What about that? And that's what I was trying to make sure. Very typical for a whole class of people, also in the West, the many New Agers produce all kinds of sweet stories, chummy stories about how nice Islam is. Like there's one example that Goelji cites, namely that Muhammad once said to his wife Hind, this is what Malkani writes, his wife Hind, actually he was not his wife, she was the wife of his main enemy, Abu Sufyan. But yes, you see, he was the leader of Mecca, and when Muhammad conquers Mecca, then all the Meccan elite, they have to submit and they have to convert to Islam. And so that's when Hind meets Muhammad. And so according to Malkani, that's also when Muhammad said, may Allah bless the country after which you are named. You see, Hind as a girl's name is modeled after the name of India, which in Arabic is Hind. And so this is normal for a girl's name, that it's named after treasure, after prosperity. So the etymology of the name Hind is correct, that has to do with India. But there is absolutely no passage in the genuine Islamic sources where Muhammad blesses the country India. So this scene is fake, it's just a made-up story. And that's essentially what the whole discourse of whitewashing Islam is about. You see, you can't whitewash Islam if you go by the real sources, which are very sobering. It's only these make-believe stories that are like that, and it is Goelji's job to pinprick those stories. Incidentally, Malkani himself was also sacked as editor by the RSS leadership precisely to punish him for having allowed Goelji to write there in the first place. So they wanted the Muslims to come to us, and they thought that Goelji was preventing that. Well, so this was another little conflict with the RSS. There are several more in his life. You could say they had a love-hate relationship. The oldest event that he told me about that made him skeptical of the RSS was when the RSS chief, Madhav Sadashiv Golwalkar, said Muhammad was a great prophet. Islam is a great religion, but the Muslims are great scoundrels. You see, that is the typical soft brain version. You hear it also all the time among Western New Agers, the idea that the prophet had seen it all. It's only his followers who didn't understand and who misinterpreted. That's also said about Jesus in Christianity. So that's the general image, that, okay, the prophet, the founder, he was perfect, but his followers, unfortunately. Well, it's precisely the other way around. You see, from a Hindu viewpoint, the Muslims are just the same people. I mean, if something happens or had happened to your great-grandfather, that he felt forced to convert to Islam, you know, you might have been them. There's just a sort of a historical coincidence that has turned some Hindus into Muslims while sparing other Hindus. Often, of course, it was also a matter of great personal sacrifice to keep your religion rather than converting, which was so much easier to do under Muslim regimes. But the factor coincidence is also there. And so many people who could have been Hindu happen to be Muslim. And so it's not that there is something intrinsically wrong with them. The only thing wrong is that they have been indoctrinated with a doctrine that is not so commendable. I mean, some people have been indoctrinated to believe that 1 and 1 is 4. Now, you don't hate those people by saying, oh no, you're wrong. 1 and 1 is 2. And so sometimes, you know, you have to be a teacher with a red pencil to scrap out these mistakes, where you really have to show that a common belief, no matter how old, no matter how venerable, no matter how associated with the parents whom you love and your teachers and so on, well, still they were teaching you a mistake. And so that has to be said, and that is what Goelji essentially said. Now, on the other hand, he also did business with the RSS several times. Like in 1964, the RSS created the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, a religious platform that sought to bring together all the Hindu sages and monks and so on. So they needed a president for that, and so they chose Sitaram Goel, or at least that's what they proposed to him. But he was quite peculiar about his own independence. He thought that the chairman of a movement should be entitled to make his own statements, to take his own positions. That they didn't want. You see, the RSS is very regimented. You have to follow the party line. And so on that, you know, they disagreed, and Goelji never became the leader of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. In 1992, he prepared the official BJP text regarding the then controversial issue of Ayodhya. So the white paper on Ayodhya, I mean, the rough copy was thrown into Goel's lap by the BJP. I was very much in Delhi at the time, so I know what this is about. So that was really a heap of disconnected pieces of evidence, and so on. So it was necessary to sew all that together, to edit this evidence. But then again, on the other side, in 1997, he edited a book, Time for Stocktaking, which was quite critical of the RSS. It is a compilation of testimonies of other Hindus, often ex-RSS men, or even still serving RSS men, who don't want to be entirely disloyal, who don't want to leave the ship, but who at the same time see that all kinds of things are wrong with it. If we look at the evolution of the RSS after Goel's death in 2003, we see that precisely those tendencies which he disapproved of, that those tendencies have only become stronger. Like, for instance, Mohan Bhagwat, the present-day leader of the RSS, once said that India is not complete without Islam. You see, that's, from a Hindu viewpoint, that's completely absurd to say. You see, Hinduism has done for thousands of years without Islam. You know, there is a phrase in Hindu parlance, Ram Rajya, the kingdom of Rama, which is seen as an ideal, as a perfect society. And so this was a few thousand years ago, definitely earlier than the first arrival of Islam in India. And so Mohan Bhagwat implies that society was not good. It lacked something, namely Islam. Well, so that would be just horrible to Goel. His best known work is his 2-volume book, Hindu Temples, What Happened to Them? So that book starts with a list of mosques forcibly replacing temples, or temples demolished, or temples transformed into mosques. So 2,000 cases of forcible takeover of temples by Islam. Note that not one of these cases has been challenged. You know, these were 2,000 falsifiable statements. If historians wanted to disagree with Goel, they could pick one of these 2,000 and show that it is not a case of a temple forcibly replacing a mosque, a mosque forcibly replacing a temple. They could have shown that, but none of them even tried even once. So this is a very, very solid list. And that's typical for Goel. First, he gets his facts verified, and then he builds conclusions on those facts. So the facts, you know, are not that unique. These were things, I mean, this was open information. He only took the trouble of bringing it together. And so since then, a few books have been written, you know, giving even more such cases. Like there is one about temple destruction in Kerala, the southwestern state, which hardly figures in this book by Goel. And so it turns out that there too, where the Muslim armies have rarely come, that there too there are very many cases of these forcible displacements in the small state of Kerala alone. The more important part of this book, the more original, the unique part of the book, is a presentation and analysis of the theological justification of this record of iconoclasm, which in India lasted more than 1,000 years, and which was also not limited to India. Like you know about the case of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which was a cathedral turned into a mosque, then briefly, under the secularism of Atatürk, turned into a neutral secular museum, and now again turned into a mosque. Or the case of the Kaaba, that's the prime example, where Muhammad himself, after the conquest of Mecca, went in, he found 360 murtis or idols were standing for worship by pilgrims, because then already it was a pilgrim site. The Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca is nothing new. This is a takeover from an older pagan pilgrimage. And then he destroyed these 360 idols with his own hands. So in fact, that is the precedent that is always cited by Muslim temple destroyers whenever they want to justify what they are doing. Then that explanation, yeah, right. He says that without that explanation, the whole Ayodhya affair, the whole Hindu fight for their temple in Ayodhya is merely a toy. You know, in fact, a toy in the hands of politicians who want to garner Hindu votes. But so those politicians preferred not to see this background because they didn't want to antagonize the Muslim community. On the contrary. So in the Ayodhya campaign, this is kept out, and this you can see in the material used in the judicial proceedings, where the pro-temple side brought lots of evidence, which is why they won the court case, but not Goel's book. You see, they try to keep it superficial to document the fact of Islamic iconoclasm, but they did not want to link the fact of iconoclasm with a theology of iconoclasm. You know, they still held the story, oh, Muhammad would have abhorred this temple destruction. No, Muhammad did precisely the same thing of temple destruction. But so, yeah, that is the BJP's policies. They like to bank on the common Hindus' emotions about all the destruction wrought by Muslims in the past or today, like what just happened in Bangladesh, where Durga Puja was destroyed in many places, where the pandals, the scenes that Hindus made in order to celebrate, that they were plundered and thrown to pieces and so on. This still happens today. And so Hindus are angry about that. The BJP is satisfied that these comments circulate among Hindus. Oh yeah, it's terrible what Muslims have been doing. And so they hope that the BJP is going to save them from that. They vote for the BJP, and then the BJP does nothing because it doesn't want to antagonize the Muslim community, which is growing, which is ever more responsible for more and more votes. And so that's what the BJP thinks of. Not that any Muslim will ever vote for the BJP. They typically vote for whichever party is in a position to defeat the BJP. But anyway, the BJP keeps hoping for these votes. They like to trample their own loyal voters in a vain hope of ever getting the votes of the enemies of Hinduism. So today, Goelji really has no influence on government policy. You know, there are many so-called experts in Western media and academia who say things like, yeah, the present Modi government is sowing discord between Hindus and Muslims. It is fanatically Hindu and so on and so on. Well, you see, all these people just prove that they don't understand anything of it. You see, I mean, I follow Indian politics and I see exactly the opposite. The BJP takes the Hindus for granted and cashes their votes and then does nothing with all that Hindu loyalty. On the contrary, they try to please their natural enemies. Those precisely who spread all the slander about them, those are the ones that the BJP is trying to please. An example, a prime example, you see, Goelji as a historian, of course, deplored and criticized all the falsehoods that are put into the history books. In fact, his own book about Islamic imperialism is precisely a critique of India's education establishment's policy of whitewashing the story of Islam in the Middle Ages. Now, with a Hindu government in power, you would think that now finally that those textbooks are going to be corrected. No, the BJP expresses its pride in not having ever changed even one line in those history books. So no influence on government policy. By contrast, the name Goelji is very popular, is sacred, is uttered with great respect on the new crop of online Hindu media. There are more and more of them. In the past, it was very difficult to get any pro-Hindu view across because the anti-Hindu mentality has been reigning supreme already for decades. So now this is possible. And so that's a very great achievement, a very good achievement. outreach to the Hindu mind and outreach to the new generation that is at home in these platforms. So that's a very important step. But if it remains there, well, then nothing will have been achieved. You see, if a civilization is really under siege, as Goelji diagnoses, then it can ill afford to leave it at that. Thank you. And if there are any questions or indeed objections, then I will gladly entertain them.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Els, for this exposition. We will invite questions, but before that, I just want to make it clear that these need to be questions and not comments or engagement into in another direction. So the focus today is Sitaramji's writings and the projection in the future. So I will actually start with the first question. So let me just unshare this thing here. So, Dr. Elst, we went over Sitaramji's contributions and, into the intellectual space and his many subject areas that he has covered. Now we have two great centenary years coming up, and in 4 years.
Where?
So one is, two centenary years in 4 years. That is 2025. It will be a centenary year for the founding or the start of the communist movement in India. So 1925 is the year when the CPI was formally established.
Yeah.
And that same year, the RSS also was established.
Oh, yes, and, that's right.
Yeah, so in 4 years, we have roughly 4 years time. And this is a question relating to the aspiring authors who want to continue the Voice of India line of thinking. You can pretty much call the Voice of India a school of thinking, a school of thought. So a 100-year assessment of these two great movements, ideological movements, you can call them, that's a centenary year is a good time to present that. So would you, in very brief, outline some kind of a guidebook or a guidance for aspiring authors who want to further this line of critique that Sitaramji started? Of course, communism is still assessment needs to be made. How much impact does communism have had on the Indian life? A lot of it's clear, but also of RSS. And the reason I bring up the assessment of or 100-year assessment of RSS from a intellectual in the intellectual space is that, of course, you mentioned the Vidar Sangh Parivar book that he has written or he has edited, where others also have contributed. But also, I have my own personal recollection of the Ram Janmabhoomi Andolan movement, and he specifically said, and that sentence of his still rings in my ear, that this is not a Hindu movement. This is a secularist movement who is just utilizing the emotional attachment to, let's say, Bhagwan Ram and the Ram Janmabhoomi Mandir to gain political power. And that is as explicit as it is, because this is what he told. So in terms of assessment of RSS from a dispassionate, from a distance, because that's how a 100-year assessment can be made. just kind of give a kind of a guidance to aspiring authors on both of these, if you can.
Yes. Well, about the founding of the Communist Party, its genesis is not an entirely glorious story in terms of contemporary sensibilities, like it was started as a daughter enterprise of the British Communist Party, of course. It was a colonial thing. And so just as right-wing British were ruling the roost in India, left-wing British also treated India as their colony. And so they extended the Communist Party. And then what the Communist Party did was also not that glorious. First of all, it was tolerated and slightly encouraged by the British, because in Bengal at the time, which was the area where it all started, the most anglicized area, there was a problem of terrorism, revolutionary terrorism, by a section of the nationalist movement. And so the British didn't like that, not that they thought it was a danger to their system, because they had no problem arresting and often hanging those revolutionaries. But it was a problem for them personally. You see, if you see, I mean, at that time, terrorism, also of non-Islamic background, often of nationalist background, was very effective. Like the Tsar of Russia was killed, one of the most powerful men on earth. The Queen of Austria-Hungary, the Empress of Austria-Hungary was killed, the famous Sita. An American president was killed. So you see, these anarchists especially were quite good in their acts of terror. And so that also could happen in India. So no British officer was sure of his life. And so you see, if you kill a Tsar, you don't kill the Tsar's system. You know, that's what they found out. And so in England, the same thing. English colonial domination would not end the day that a British officer got killed. But nevertheless, it's very unpleasant if you have to, you know, live with that kind of death sentence on your head. So they wanted to stop this terrorist movement. Now, one thing they did was in the men that they brought into prison, they gave them communist literature. They channeled them towards communism. And so communism was in fact partly generated by the British effort to make Indian revolutionaries somehow collaborate indirectly. Of course, they still felt the same resistance against British rule, but the communists have a different approach to violence. You see, Lenin described the extreme left that would commit leftist terrorism as a childhood disease. You see, in his view, violence is only useful in the decisive stage of the revolution. Then it helps in toppling the institutions of the establishment. But on the whole, they are against wild violence, against terror. And so that, you know, the British liked. And so they built up the Communist Party in a sense. Incidentally, that's also something that Goel was quite aware of. When he wrote against communism, people asked him, but aren't you afraid for your life? And he said, no, you see, I've read my Lenin. And so this terror, these assassinations are not part of their methods. Okay, so Then another thing you need to know about the Communist Party is that it supported the partition plan. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Ram Swarup did not grow into a communist. You see, many of those leftists in the 40s shifted and shifted farther to the left. Many of them became communist. So that's one of the reasons he didn't do that. He criticized the support for the partition. You know, even though he himself was not religious at that time, he saw that precisely the partition was a religious project. It was dictated by Islam. And from a Marxist viewpoint of the prosperity of the masses and so on, it was a negative thing. It would not help the Muslim masses, only the Muslim elites. So you see there, the Communist Party nevertheless thought that, you know, it was a good thing against the Tatas and Birlas, as they summarized the capitalist class, these two famous industrial entrepreneurs, Tata and Birla. So for them, you see, partition was a slap in the face for that class. So they supported partition. Of course, they were not thanked for their services. You see, they were fairly useful in the sense that they could provide non-Islamic, intellectual sounding argumentations for this Islamic project. And so they did. But when partition was achieved, in East Bengal, there were many of these communists. They were asked to vacate East Bengal and to come to India, or to go to India. That was a bit less violent than what happened, for example, in Iran in 1979, when the communists supported the Ayatollahs in overthrowing the Shah, and then being thanked for their services by getting massacred. Right, but so essentially it was the same formula, the same thing that happened. Finally, I want to mention the founding role of the communists in creating certain myths about Islam in Indian history. It is M.N. Roy himself, the founder of the Communist Party, who launched the idea that Indian Muslims, or especially Hindus, who had wanted to escape the horrors of the caste system by converting, because Islam brought a message of equality. Now, you see, there's no such thing as equality in Islam. There is, first of all, famously a system of Islamic slavery that has never been abandoned. There's no abolitionist movement in the Muslim world. On the contrary, it's only under foreign, mainly British, later American pressure that slavery was abolished. And even then it can revive at short notice, as we have seen with the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq in 2014-15. You see the pagans, namely the Yazidis, that they could lay their hand on, they immediately turned into slaves. So there's no equality in Islam, no idea of equality. Even among Muslims, there is no equality. There are several verses in the Quran where it is described precisely as a sign of ungratefulness towards God if you, as a rich man, favor equality. Because you see, God has chosen sovereignly to make you rich. And so if you refuse being richer than the people around you, that's an act of ingratitude against God. So Islam is in favor of equality, not just by default, no, on a very principled basis. It's very consistent with its theology. You see, part of Islam is fatalism. You know, there's nothing you can do if God doesn't want it. Inshallah, you know, if God wants it, then something will happen. Like, for instance, there is a scene in Muhammad's life. First, he tells his men that if they rob or if they raid caravans and take people hostage, and then extract a ransom from their families in order to send them back home, then you see if they have women around, these hostages, then they can rape those women, but on condition that they practice coitus interruptus. Yes, you see. Maybe you're surprised that the saintly Muhammad did those kinds of things, but that's what is described in the Orthodox Islamic sources. So at first he says, you know, I am a robber chieftain, of course, but I have my code of honor. And so one thing is that if I extract ransom for something, I want to give it back in its original condition. So when that something is women and they're not pregnant, I don't want to give them back in a pregnant state. Okay, so you have to practice coitus interruptus. But then on the next occasion, you know, he wants to give the same instruction, but then he thinks, well, you know, if God really doesn't want pregnancy to occur, then it won't occur. So you can go rape them. You know, if somehow they get pregnant, it means that God had wanted it. So there is this notion of fatalism. And so similarly, if you are born rich or poor, it's God who wanted it that way. So you see, this is all very consistent with Islamic theology, yet it is the communists who try to whitewash all that to give a secular explanation. And so, whereas many people were converted under pressure or under sheer force with the dagger to their throats, even though that happened, they try to give a secular explanation, one that moreover has the advantage of incriminating Hinduism. So they said that, oh yeah, it was Hindus who were oppressed, and they were so happy with the message of equality that Islam brought that they converted to Islam. So all this false history, you see, is very much the handiwork of the communists. So yeah, maybe it's a good idea to really inventorize all that, you see, to really make an overview of the contribution of communism to false history. Then as for the RSS, also almost 100 years, well, I would, you know, ask what they have achieved in those 100 years. You see, Hedgewar, Dr. Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, who founded the RSS in 1925, he had certain ideas, like he put the stress on nationalism because this was the era of nationalism. This was the national struggle. And so that's what was uppermost in people's minds, the national interest. And so if you took over the slogans of nationalism that were then current in Europe, this was after the First World War, when national armies had fought each other, when every young man had, you know, lived under the flag with the anthem on his lips every day for the king or the emperor. You know, at that time, nationalism was all over the place. And so you see that kind of language also in the symbolism of the RSS, like they walk in uniform, they have military style drills, they have brass bands, you know, Western style. It's not very native Hindu, you know, that's very copied from the West. Anyway, but for all that Western influence, nevertheless, Hedgewar was still a Hindu, and he sought specifically also to unite the Hindus. And so he conflated Hinduism with India. And in the nationalist paradigm, that meant that only Hindus are real Indians and the others are not. And so it is, of course, true that Islam and Christianity came from abroad. They are not Indian religions. But does that imply that people who follow those religions are therefore not Indians, that I find quite doubtful. Nevertheless, that was the idea of Hindutva in those days. What has become of all that? You see, what have they achieved? And there you see, RSS men are going to point to two things. One is all the good social work they have done. And so the most conspicuous is during calamities, floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, and so on, when they are immediately there, mobilized to offer help in emergency situations. So that merit they certainly have. And it's very typical that many of you wouldn't even know about it because the media are absolutely silent about it. Like I remember a photograph in a newspaper in my country about some disaster happening in India. And so you see refugees flock, to a tent where there is some inscription in Hindi, which nobody in my country can read, but I can read that it says that this is the RSS. So you see, nobody's told about the good work by the RSS. And so that good work is certainly there, only that is not what the RSS was founded for. You see, it had a political goal. It meant to make Hindus stronger and so on. And so I would say that that has not happened. On the contrary, the percentage of Hindus in India has grown less. The territory controlled by Hindus has become less with the partition. Then even inside India, more and more parts of India are becoming foreign territory to Hindus. Hindus are running away from areas of Muslim concentration like Malabar, like Mewat, like parts of West Bengal. And then especially, far more important than that numerical loss is that the intensity of Hinduness in Hindus themselves is becoming less and less. Hindus are becoming less Hindus, less Hindu. They are becoming mostly Americanized. So that's not a drama or something, but that's certainly not what Hedgewar had in mind. That was not the goal of the RSS. And then the second thing they will say is, but look, now you see, we have conquered political power. We have a government in power. Who would have thought that in 1925? Well, the thing is that you have a party in power that has some historical links with the RSS, but that itself totally disowns any special relation with Hinduism. That calls itself a nationalist party, and that is indeed justified for national causes. That party has indeed achieved certain things. Like right now, the army is being taken care of. And so there's an increasing threat from China, from the Taliban and so on. So it's a good thing that the army is now kept in shape as opposed to under Congress governments. The international standing of India has certainly improved. This is certainly one of the achievements that Modi can be proud of. Then, of course, sanitation, the development of India, socio-economic development has also improved. About the strictly economic thing, I am not competent to say much. I noticed that Subramanian Swamy has written a book criticizing government economic policies. So he says about that, okay, you see, he gave some free advice to the government about improving their economic policies, but that Modi is completely deaf on that side, that, you can take a horse to the river, but you can't force it to drink. Nevertheless, economic policy in India is slightly better than it was under Congress. Then a vast improvement is the scaling down of corruption. Now, I don't say that corruption doesn't exist in the BJP, but still, you see, the immense records for corruption that Congress has set, you see, that's a thing of history now. So the BJP can indeed, from a nationalist viewpoint, show some achievements. Oh, and I would almost forget the most important or the most conspicuous one, the normalization of Kashmir. You see, this they could do. It was an issue that Hindus felt strongly about, and Muslims also, at least Kashmiri Muslims, because for the other Muslims in India, Kashmir being part of India rather than Pakistan is in fact an assurance that Muslims have a place in India. So they are not so much on the hand of Kashmiri separatism. But nevertheless, it's an issue that was very alive, that had a religious dimension, because of course, Kashmir only had a special status because it is majority Muslim. That is what was in the mind of Jawaharlal Nehru when he created the situation. But formally, in the letter of the law, there is no reference to religion at all. And that's why the BJP could take up the issue, because they absolutely are dead afraid of any mention of the word Hindu. But so that was not the case in Article 370. So they could normalize the situation in Kashmir in that regard. And that was a very good move. And it showed also that things that were deemed impossible for decades can in fact be easily and swiftly solved. So that was a very good thing. Nevertheless, those are national issues, specifically Hindu issues, which were very much in the mind of Hedgewar when he founded the RSS. There, the BJP has failed completely. So all the discriminations that exist in practice, but also in theory, in the letter of laws and of certain constitutional articles, about that, absolutely nothing has been done. You see, how can you have this situation where minorities can have their own schools, can administer their own places of worship, while Hindus can't? This is so humiliating, so harmful to Hindu life. So any normal person who is not very hostile to Hinduism wouldn't allow this to continue for a day. And yet the BJP in power with a very comfortable majority in parliament is allowing it to continue now already for 7.5 years. That I think is all quite shameful. In fact, in some respects, the BJP is making it even worse. Like, you know, some BJP people would protest when Congress governments nationalize temples, take over temples. But the BJP itself is now doing the same thing. Its state governments have done it in Rajasthan, in Uttarakhand, and there is no sign from the BJP that they want to reverse this. So then in schools, you see, with the Right to Education Act, schools have to bear the burden for 25% non-paying poor pupils, but only if they're Hindu schools. Minority schools don't have to do this. So this is open discrimination with heavy financial consequences against the Hindus. And many Hindu schools have been forced to close because they couldn't bear this burden. Then the BJP has founded a number of colleges, especially for Muslims. And they've even talked about, I don't know if it's been implemented yet, founding colleges where the minorities would be allowed, and of the Hindu community, only the girls. You see, first of all, of course, this is another way of de-Hinduizing, namely taking over American woke values. So this one of discriminating in favor of women is an example. And here you see they put Hindu women together with Muslim men. That's organizing love jihad, which is one of the Islamic strategies for achieving more conversions. So, I mean, putting it all together, I wouldn't call that a success. And so, yes, you see, maybe the approaching 100th anniversary of the RSS is a good occasion to really diagnose this failure.
Yeah, thank you. We have two at least very good questions. So I'm just going to prioritize on them. Lakshmi Devi, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, Lakshmi Devi? And also please turn your video on. Lakshmi Devi, he had asked a very good question on pacifism.
My question is, when we read about Thoreau, about civil disobedience.
Yeah, you need to kind of speak up, or because we cannot hear you.
You can't hear me?
Just a little bit more louder if you can.
Yeah, like I was talking about.
Yeah,
like,
that's good.
Yeah, pacifism, which like Thoreau talks in his essays on civil disobedience and all. And at later stage like he accepted the necessity to interfere when something is wrong happening. Like in the case of slaves, he wanted to, when John Brown, like he rescued slaves and all, in that case, he supported the outright, violence and attacking somebody who is holding slaves. And also from pacifism, he has shifted his views towards radicalism when somebody has to correct the wrong. So when we talk about ideological freedom struggle, just by ideological freedom struggle, can we win this war against the haters of Hindutva? So where does and how does Sita and Goel would have stood like on this issue? Like, will he prefer to at sometimes resorting to violence or any kind of violent protest against the people like who are waging war against us? What
right.
you prefer?
Yes, your question clearly had to do with the Ghandian principle of non-violence. So in his young days, of course, because he was a Ghandian activist, probably wedded to this principle of non-violence. Though about that, you see, he hasn't thematized much. He was in favor of non-violent approaches, but probably not in the extremist Ghandian sense. You see, once in a while, violence simply is the lesser evil. And so in the wars against Islam, once in a while, a strong military stand was necessary. And so you see about that, he didn't make any Ghandian fuss about that. But on the whole, you see, he tried to avoid violence. And so his critique of Islam is a way to avoid physical conflict. You see, in the West, there is this discourse, this woke discourse about Islamophobia. And so people who criticize Islam are accused of Islamophobia. And then at the same time, a claim is made that it is because of Islamophobia that America and Britain and France have invaded Middle Eastern countries from Mali and Libya through Syria, Iraq to Afghanistan. Now that's absolutely not true, you see, and the facts on this are easy to trace. Each of the Western presidents or defense ministers or so who have ordered troops into a Middle Eastern country, each of them, without exception, have praised Islam to the sky, and none of them has ever criticized Islam. So whatever this funny notion of Islamophobia may be, they are definitely not guilty of it. Nevertheless, they have ordered their planes to throw bombs on Muslim countries, which happened to entail the killing of thousands of Muslims. Now, for this, of course, they have an explanation. David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, said, these are not Muslims, these are monsters, when he talked about terrorists. No, you see, they themselves define themselves as Muslims, not as monsters. Go ask Osama bin Laden, are you a monster? No, I am a faithful Muslim. And I did what I did because I am a Muslim, because Islam demands it. John Kerry, the American defense minister under Obama, he justified an intervention in Syria, saying that the terrorist version of Islam is not the real Islam, and that therefore they were going to use their bombs in order to defend real Islam against the false Islam of the Muslim terrorists. So this is an anti-Islamophobic discourse justifying the bombing of a Muslim population. So Islamophilia is far more dangerous, certainly for non-Muslims, but even for Muslims. And so this Islam criticism is far healthier. You see, in that sense, you see, Sitaram Goel has been an enormous healer for India. He restored a sane attitude towards problematic doctrines. But was that an answer to your question?
Yeah. Okay. We can move to the next question, because the next question is also a very loaded one. VK, can you give us your full name, please? VK. And you can unmute also yourself. Or I can read off his question if he doesn't want to speak up.
My question is my name is Vivekant.
Okay.
My question is on the spiritual gurus. What is your opinion on how they are doing, and do you think their spread of spirituality and dharmic values will have any ideological implications?
I understood the words you spoke, but I'm not sure I understood your question.
Yeah, let me repeat. So my question was around the spiritual gurus, the current set of gurus who are spreading the value of Dharma, spreading spirituality. Do you think that will have an impact, and what is the ideological relation of that with the political Hindutva? Do you think it'll aid, help, soften?
Well, let me say first of all some things that most people in the West don't know. You seem to be a born Hindu. You might know, but most people in the West will be shocked to hear this. It is that most gurus, even those who come to the West, have Hindutva convictions, and or pro-Hindu conviction, not always Hindu nationalist, but certainly pro-Hindu, and hold convictions that Western Indologists and media, India watchers call fanatical. And so this is very common. You talk in their presence about a Muslim problem. Maybe one or two is going to say, oh, no, we should only be positive. We shouldn't talk about this bad news about Muslims doing this and that. But most of them are going to just fall in line with whatever you expect to hear in Hindutva circles. So yes, they may have a high spiritual level. They may be doing all their yoga exercises and so on. Nevertheless, they have the opinions that are usual in Hindu circles. So, so I don't think that spirituality makes too much difference there. Even, I mean, I've found out that most gurus share the ideas that are common in the circles where they come from. And so, of course, there are different circles in India, so there are also different opinions among gurus. But I mean, the idea that simply by doing yoga, you suddenly rise to a higher intellectual level as well and have more enlightened opinions, I don't see that. Not at all. There are certainly yoga practitioners who are more drawn to non-violence. That's indeed one of the values that yogis swear allegiance to. It is non-violence, ahimsa. And so, as Hindus know, ahimsa doesn't necessarily mean what Gandhi made it to mean. You know, strict non-violence under any circumstances. But nevertheless, you see, they will be economic with violence, as you know, as little violence as possible. That may happen, but you see, any like more positive idea of Islam or so, I wouldn't count on it. If they say positive things about Islam, it's usually because they don't know anything about it. Like you see, I don't know what he thinks of it now, but Sri Ravi Shankar has written booklets about Christianity and Islam maybe 10 years ago that are just so silly, so sentimental, you know, saying the usual stuff that all religions say the same thing and so on. So this is all just not true. This is sentimentalist nonsense. In fact, if I remember correctly, he once faced Zakir Naik, the Islamic polemicist, in a debate, and he was completely routed. So, and even, you know, being routed, even just the debate, or physically, even physically, you know, like what happened during partition. In East Bengal, you had, you know, establishments of the Ramakrishna mission where they said, oh, all religions say the same thing. Then partition came, they were terrorized by Muslims, so they packed up and they went across the border to India. And there they again started saying, oh, all religions say the same thing. So, you know, you have those people, but those people just don't know the topic. And so it is perfectly possible to reach a high level of yoga and still talk nonsense, because that's what you've been taught and you never bother to question it. All right. So, you know, Goelji, I think, was simply of the common sense view that, of course, in general, violence is to be avoided, but sometimes it is unavoidable. It's the lesser evil. It's not a good thing, but it's sometimes the lesser evil.
We can move to the next. I think there's a good question from Manish Pandey, but I don't think he's able to speak. So I'll just read out his question. So he asks, what are the views of Goelji on anti-Brahmanism and how deep-rooted they were in those days than today? And number two is, are there any views of Goelji on revival of pride of being Hindu among Shudras?
Yes. Okay. Well, about anti-Brahmanism, he shows that when Alexander the Great came to India and he questioned people about the secret of their strength, he soon found out that the Brahmins were the root of that strength. Because you see, they gave people something to live for, something to fight for. They taught people to live with honor. And so that's why they were strong. They didn't just give in. They didn't sell themselves to invaders. So this connection between hated Hinduism and Brahmins, that's been around for already a long time. And Muslim invaders specialized in terrorizing and massacring Brahmins. And the Portuguese in Goa did the same thing. So yeah, Brahmanism is a necessary element of anti-Hinduism. So it's important to do something about anti-Brahmanism. I don't know how strong it is at the moment, because now for a few years I haven't been in India anymore, and even before that, of course, I only frequented certain circles. Intellectuals, mostly English speaking, urban, and so on. So there's a very large part of Hindu society that I have no contact with at all. So what I'm saying here may not be very representative. And so I really wonder what the state of anti-Brahmanism is at the moment. I met someone from Bangalore 2-3 years ago who said that, you see, they had formed a sort of a self-help group of Brahmins because they felt the heat of anti-Brahmanism really seriously, really pinching. I don't know, but I've never heard anything like that elsewhere. So as far as I know, anti-Brahmanism exists in cold print, but not really live. But I'm not sure about that. Not at all. Because of course, when you see anti-Brahmin rhetoric, like when you look at anti-Brahmin cartoons, you see they look exactly like anti-Jewish cartoons in Der Stürmer, a Nazi paper in the 30s, the 1930s, I mean. So this anti-Brahmanism seems very nasty and very strong, but then it's not the Indian mentality to take that too serious or to make serious work of it. You see that the fabled German thoroughness is a very good thing in many respects, but in this respect, it led to taking such cartoons a bit too seriously. And so that's not in the Indian temperament, I think. But again, that is an open question. My answer there must be limited. Then about Goel's views on the revival of pride of being Hindu among Shudras. About that, he's hardly said anything, except of course that he observed that most Hindu-Muslim riots are in fact Muslim Dalit riots. That is mostly the low castes who do the fighting. And that's not because it's the upper castes who use them as cannon fodder or something. No. It is because they themselves genuinely have conflicts with Muslims. But there is one case in history that he emphasized, namely in Andhra, there is a story of I think the Kakatiya dynasty, which was of Shudra origin. And so when the Muslim invaders had defeated the Kshatriyas, then Shudras took their place and did the fighting. And also, of course, rose in the caste hierarchy, but remained Shudras. And so they were very proud of being Hindus, of defending cows and Brahmins, as it is called. So yes, you see, and in fact, if Hinduism survives, it is largely thanks to Shudras, who do not get poisoned and contaminated with all these ideas that you find in universities and so on. You see, most of the anti-Hindu campaigners have been Brahmins. And that's not a traditional Brahmin privilege or something. No, it is because they are most open to new Western ideas. And so they interiorize those. And so there you have a certain, you see, purity, proletarian purity with Hinduism staying more alive in lower classes. Though I think that evolves in a negative sense, in this sense that the anti-Hindu propaganda, also the divisive propaganda, low castes against high castes and so on, that is gaining ground, that's systematically pushed down the Hindus' throats through the education system. And so I think that that is it's paying off for the enemy. That's another reason why it is really urgent to correct the history lessons in schools, that which the BJP absolutely doesn't want to touch with a barge pole now already for 7 years. It's urgently necessary to sanitize the textbooks, to liberate them from their hostile, from their divisive contents.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Elst. We are running out of time, so just one last question. That question is from Sandeep Sai on Gandhism. So Sandeep can unmute and ask the question.
Sir, it's Sandeep Panigrahi from Odisha.
Yes. Okay.
So I just wanted, because the question is on SR Sitaram Goel. Sitaram Goel has written vociferously in exaltation of Gandhi and even Ram Swarup. Do you think that maybe because the Gandhi's complete works were not published at those time, they are not in knowledge and information about the many acts of Gandhi, and had a symbolic aspect of him and therefore eulogized him?
Well, let's say that, of course, they had for personal reasons, they still had a certain soft corner for him. But of course, they knew about the criticism of Gandhi that has developed in the meantime. First, let's start with the very first writing. At the time of the assassination itself, Ram Swarup wrote a little booklet, commenting upon it. I've personally not seen a physical copy of the booklet. I'm trying to recover one from his heritage. You see, his family donated all his heritage to some library in his native town of Sonipat. And so, after the Corona thing is over, I'm certainly going to go there and find out. But he himself told me the contents of the book, namely that first of all, it was unbecoming for a great figure like Gandhi. It was unbecoming to die in his bed. You see, for a man of such stature, getting assassinated is fitting. And then, moreover, there's a second position he takes in that book. Well, maybe I'll think of it. It's somewhere. Now, first, let's go into the future. You see, the idea that developed in the case of Ram Swarup is still very Gandhian. Like, for instance, he wrote a book on economics, comparing Gandhian economics with Marxist economics. And there he's certainly on the side of Gandhian economics. But that he was guilty for partition, well, of course, that they also knew. I mean, they were there in the partition. They were in Delhi, helping in refugee camps and so on. They heard all the stories firsthand. And then later a lot has been published about. No, not a lot. No, it was a sort of unsecular and therefore forbidden, but still a few things were published. And and at the time itself, the Sikh committee, what's it called, Shiromani Prabandhak Gurudwara Committee or something, they published a whole list of testimonies, which Voice of India has republished. So they knew all about it, and so they also knew about Gandhi's famous statements like, it's not just in my book about Gandhi that you can find them. In a very, very well-known book, Freedom at Midnight, by Collins and Lapierre, you already find a number of statements of Gandhi quoted, where he says, for example, yes, you see, if your life is threatened in Pakistan, this is said to the refugees in Delhi, refugees who had seen their whole family butchered and so on. You see, refugees with terrible stories who had lost everything. He told them, yeah, then you should go back to Pakistan. And it's better to get killed there than to run away. I mean, you see, if you read what Gandhi said to the refugees from West Pakistan, he was mad. And so I can understand, you see, that people really thought, you know, this man deserves a punishment, not thinking of the consequences, because the consequences for the Hindu movement were very negative. Nevertheless, one of the conspirators whom I interviewed in the 90s when he was still alive, Madan Lal Pahwa, he, before he joined in the conspiracy, he had been living in what was becoming Pakistan. And so his family decided to move out. There were 22 of them. Nearby was a railway station, so they were going to train by train to India. But you see, his aunt or grandmother or so was afraid of this modern technology. She wanted to go on foot. And so he, as a young lad, you know, to sort of protect her, to, you know, make it possible for her, he went with her on foot. Now, they had agreed to meet at a railway station inside India. But you see, when they came there, it turned out that the entire train had arrived full of corpses. So his entire family had been massacred. So, you know, you can imagine the state of mind of people who said, well, this is too much, let's kill Gandhi. And so that's what they did. So I've never heard from Goel or from Ram Sarup any approval of this murder. But at the same time, they were, of course, perfectly aware of what Gandhi had done. And so this, you know, the stuff he said to the refugees at the time, I think that's unpardonable.
Okay. All right. I think we are out of time. So once again, a wonderful session on the future of this line of thinking. And we will continue to have more programs as we go along, and we'll continue to have your, you know, able guidance, and especially to aspiring scholars who want to write further on this line of thinking. Once again, Dr. Elst, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
And keep coming back for future programs. And thanks to all those attended. I know there are a lot of Zoom calls going on, but you chose this one. We truly appreciate your gesture. Thank you, and bye.
Namaste.